Well, evolution is false and it makes all kinds of false predictions. And I'm here today with Cornelius Hunter, who has a PhD in biophysics and has just studied, in addition to that, the history and philosophy behind evolution. And today we're going to be talking about one of the false predictions that evolution made about histone proteins. So, welcome, Dr. Hunter. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about histones. If you could bring up the slides that I have there. Before I get into histones, I want to set just a little bit of context and talk about the genome. And there are a couple of papers that came out in the last couple of months that is really going to help us kind of set the context. So without further ado, here is one of the papers that just came out here late December. And both of these papers are making great breakthroughs in work that has been ongoing for the last few decades on what's exactly going on in the genome. Now, when I say genome, I want to make sure I'm clear. We're talking about the advanced version of the genome in eukaryotes. So remember, eukaryotes have a nucleus and the genome is inside the nucleus, and it's a pretty complicated structure and function. Prokaryotes are simpler, archaea are kind of in between. So we're going to be focusing on eukaryotes, the nucleus, genome inside the nucleus. And so here is a paper that has done a fantastic job. It's a huge number of authors and paper on studying the genome, but in particular, the structure of the genome. And when I say structure, I'm talking about spatial structure, the three-dimensional structure, because it's very difficult to study the three-dimensional structure of the genome. And by the way, is my audio good?
Yep.
Okay, good, because I didn't have my mic right where I wanted it, but I guess it's good enough. So the three-dimensional structure of the genome is very complicated, and we haven't really been able to study it. You can't just zoom in and look at the genome like with a microscope. It's just too complicated. It's too small, it's too detailed, and there's too many things you want to see, including the sequence of the nucleotides, and it's time varying, and it's different in different cells. So what they're doing in these advanced papers is using a bunch of different methods to look at the genome and putting them together. So it's really, really exciting research. I'll just talk briefly about these two different papers. So here's what they say. The dynamic, that is time varying, three-dimensional organization of the human genome, so they're calling it 4D, so position and time, is linked to what? The genome function. So function is not merely determined by the sequence of nucleotides, as we're often kind of talk about, and as evolutionists have often advocated, but it's actually the geometric positioning of these and how that varies over time. Now, the big problem with this is it's so complicated that it's hard to talk about and it's hard to teach. And so that's one reason why people don't know about it. It's just so complicated. And they gave a shot here with this figure. And you can see it's kind of a cartoon figure. So on the left, there's kind of a notional cartoon of the nucleus and the genome, which just looks like it's kind of like spaghetti. And then on the right, how it maps to function. And so if you look at the spaghetti on the left, you zoom in, you say, okay, there's some structure here. There's something going on. There's a higher density areas where the genome is packed together, clustered together, is doing something. So we're giving some colors here, blue, yellow, green. These are doing things, and they map to some function. So this is about as good as you can do at a high level to try and explain something which is just out of this world complicated. 3D models of the nuclear environment of all genes, including their long-range interactions with distal elements. So what does that mean, distal elements and long range? What are we talking about long range? This is a nucleus. How can this maybe be long range? So what they mean by long range is you have this 3 billion nucleotides in the human genome. It folds up into this compact spaghetti thing inside the nucleus. So nucleotides and segments of DNA that were far apart might now be close together. Same sort of an idea as with proteins. Globular proteins fold up, and all of a sudden you have distant amino acids in the primary structure are now neighbors in the tertiary structure. Same sort of thing here in the nucleus, and that's going to be important. And so when you have distant features in the sequence coming together, that's called distal elements, distal interactions. Distal, far, long range interactions. Well, they're close range in space. They're long range in the primary sequence. So, that's just the way the terminology is. So one example is enhancers. Enhancers are DNA segments that can amplify or increase the transcription of a gene. So you have these genes, they got to be copied. The word for copying is transcription or transcribing. So they need to be transcribed in order for that gene to be expressed. There's all kinds of mechanisms in the cell to regulate that transcription, to down-regulate it, up-regulate it, turn off the gene, turn it on. And we've known about these for years, even though we don't quite understand exactly how they work. And so there are these enhancer segments that we know they can amplify the transcription of a gene. If a protein comes and binds to it, that can help. These proteins are called transcription factors, TFs, transcription factors. So a protein binds to the enhancer, and that can amplify the transcription of a gene. So maybe the cell you just had a big meal, you need some enzymes to be produced. Some of those enzymes are going to be transcribed. Those genes are going to be transcribed and then translated into these proteins, these enzymes.
But can I ask a question? I know this is interrupting your presentation because we're trying to get to the false prediction. But where does the knowledge lie? Like, how do the enhancers know what to enhance?
I mean, $64,000 question. There's always the next, well, how did that happen? Well, how did that happen? Why? Well, how did it know that? Yeah. So we can you do enough experiments, and you usually can answer that question. So how does it know that? Well, you ate the meal is sitting there, and it sends a signal. There's hormones or whatever, signals are sent, neurological signals are sent, and cells pick those up, and it's like, oh, I need to now do something. And so by the miracle of miracles, there are all these, signals and pathways in our bodies that create all these actions that cause these actions to happen. So that's the cartoon level answer to your question. Where's the knowledge? It's in our bodies, but it's just like super complicated. So,
well, even at this level of complication complexity that you're describing, it seems obvious that this has to be something that is designed, because this is not the type of thing that could come about by chemical and physical processes, right?
I'll say more about that in three or four slides. Okay. Yeah. So these enhancers, okay, they can amplify, increase the transcription of genes, particular target genes. Okay, fine. But they can work on distal genes, that is far away genes. So the enhancer is here, but the gene that it's turning on is over here. How does that work? And so when this was first discovered, many years ago, we've known about this for a long time. It's like, oh, I wonder how that works. So somehow, it works out somehow. So we're getting more and more clarity on this with studies like this. So when you fold up the genome, the enhancer, maybe it's closer to the target gene. And so in space, so the geometry is becoming, that's kind of the message here. The geometry and the geometry of the structure is increasingly important if you're going to understand biology. And so if you're into bioinformatics or molecular biology or biophysics, there's kind of these two different terms you'll hear a lot: sequence and structure. Sequence and structure. You hear that a lot. That applies to RNA, it applies to proteins, it applies to the genome. Sequence and structure. What is the sequence? Well, for RNA and for DNA, the genome, it's nucleotides, 4 different nucleotides. And there's a sequence of billions of these nucleotides, like letters strung together. That's the sequence. what's the structure? That's the three-dimensional actual physical structure of these things taking on different structures. It's time varying. Not only is it really, really complicated, it's time varying. When the cell divides, it takes on a whole different structure. When it's sitting there doing its thing, normal times, it also is evolving and morphing and changing as per the conditions. So it's not just sitting there statically, which is another mind blow. And it's also incredibly dense. I talked about high density regions and low density regions in the nucleus. That's true. There are high density and low density regions, and transcription is best in kind of the medium level density. So right there, you've got this complexity of like, okay, if you're going to open up a gene and transcribe it, it should be kind of in the medium density areas. None of this is cast in concrete. We don't fully understand how it works. So don't take what I'm saying as gospel. It's just, this is this kind of thing that researchers are looking at. So it's just incredibly complicated to have this level of specificity and geometric complexity in the nucleus. Now, let's go to the next one. The genome is organized at different scales. So if you were to zoom in, let's say you had a fantastic microscope that could do all things. You're looking at the nucleus and you zoom in. When you're still looking at the entire genome, you'll see the large scale structures, like it's shown in this diagram here, the blue ball and the yellow ball and the green. Those are large scale structures. And then you zoom in closer and closer, and now you're starting to see mid-level structures, the loopings and things. And then you zoom in even more, and you'll see fine-grained structures at the tactical or the low level. And it's incredible, that it reveals an organization. It's not just, this is just jammed in here. It's just, the only thing that matters is sequence. The structure doesn't matter. It's just the genome is just jammed in. That is an incredibly naive, false view that unfortunately the evolution was promoting for many years. Now, so there's organized at different scales, different levels. Let's have a look. I think the next slide. Okay, at the local scale of the chromatin fiber, nucleosome positioning and histone modification influence the structure and accessibility of DNA. So just you can read more details of the paper. They're talking about these different levels of structure. Chromatin fiber, nucleosome positioning. Oh, wait a minute, what's a nucleosome? What does that mean? We'll talk about nucleosome in 1 second, but that can actually move. Nucleosomes can actually move. Histone modifications. What are histones? We'll talk about that in 1 second, but those can be modified. So all kinds of dynamics happening. At the scale of up to hundreds of kilobases, chromatin loops form in a dynamic manner. So just these different levels, different scales of structure, of organization. So let's look at 1 minute on this video, and we'll speed it up so it's faster than a minute. So why don't you show this video, and then we can talk about.
In this animation, we'll see the remarkable. DNA is tightly packed up to fit into the nucleus of every cell. The process starts with assembly of a nucleosome, which is formed when 8 separate histone protein subunits attach to the DNA molecule. The combined tight loop of DNA and protein is the nucleosome. Multiple nucleosomes are coiled together, and these then stack on top of each other. The end result is a fiber of packed nucleosomes known as chromatin. This fiber, which at this point is condensed to a thickness of 30 nanometers, is then looped and further packaged using other proteins which are not shown here. This remarkable multiple folding allows 6 feet of DNA to fit into the nucleus of each cell in our body, an object so small that 10,000 nuclei could fit on the tip of a needle. The end result is that the DNA is tightly packed into the familiar structures we can see through a microscope, chromosomes. Okay, it is important to realize that chromosomes are not always present. They form only when cells are dividing.
There we go. Excellent. So, yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So the idea there is, what's the lowest level of structure in the DNA? It's the double helix. That's the finest grained structure that we normally think of. Right? It's a double helix. These 2 different strands. Each strand is a thread of nucleotides. They're twisted around each other, so it's a double. Each one is forming a helix. So what happens then? I mean, it doesn't just sit around as this double helix, right? there's a protein hub. That's the blue in this graphic. The blue machine there is 8 proteins. They're working together, forming a hub, and then the double helix is wound around it. Now, the hub, I said it's 8 proteins. They are histones. There's a few different types of histones. They're similar, but just think of them as histones, histone proteins. 8 histone proteins working together to form a hub. And then you have this double helix wound around it. That's kind of the core fundamental structure of the DNA in our cells, and that's called a nucleosome. There's a lot of nucleosomes. By the way, I want to point out one other thing just to put in the back of your head. These histones that you see, this blue-purple machine, they have tails. And when I say tail, I mean just one end of the histone protein sticks off out on its own like a tail. So you can see on the left there's a little purple tail. You can see another purple tail, a couple purple tails there. And those are controls. So you can actually control the histone or control the nucleosome by attaching small organic molecules to those tails. That's called epigenetics, which is just another incredible regulation method of regulation for regulating the expression of genes. So you can control these nucleosomes. The other thing about these nucleosomes can slide. They can actually move along the DNA, which is another incredible thing. And now, when you form these nucleosomes, you'll form a bunch of them adjacent, so one after the other. So you have a little trail, like a bead, beads on a string. They then will fold up together, and you'll get a cluster of nucleosomes. And that's what that video showed. You can look this up on YouTube, by the way. It's a really great video. I always show this to my class each year, each semester. So the nucleosomes form a little ball, a little bead, and they coil around each other. You could put it that way. Once they have formed the bead, that you have a bunch of those, that then can coil around itself. And that's what that video showed. So you have the nucleosomes forming, the nucleosomes come together, and then that forms a thicker, structure, and it then can coil on itself. So you started off with a double helix. You then wound it around nucleosomes. So that was kind of the second level of coiling. And then those nucleosomes clustered together, and then they formed a bigger structure. And then it coiled around itself. So you're having coiling upon coiling. And that's how you have this really dense amount, a tremendous amount of DNA packed into your cell. And you may have heard these crazy statistics, like if all the DNA in your body was stretched out as far as it could and attached, it would go to the moon and back like 100,000 times or something. It's just crazy numbers of like, what? How could that be? And it's just this incredible stacking of this packing technology using these histone proteins. They're the key, or part of the key to packing this DNA into your genome, but also controlling it. So I talked about the tail, but also the fact that you can move the nucleosome. These are all critical parts of the dynamic nature. But what I'm describing here is the low level. Remember, I talked about zooming in and zooming out. This is the low level. This is at the very low level. And as you move up, it gets, and the end of the video kind of showed that, it kind of zoomed out. So, okay, this coils and this coils, and then you end up with these chromosomes. And so, and then there's all kinds of looping structures that you can have, and those will influence the functionality that we talked about from that paper.
Now, something they said at the end of the video was interesting, and I did not understand this before, but they said you can't always see the chromosomes, like the chromosomes aren't always present.
Right.
So I was unaware of that. I did not know that.
And most people aren't aware of that. So because we've all seen, Mr. Winston in 10th grade biology showed us those pictures of the X structures, right? And the centromeres at the middle and the telomeres at the end, and that's the chromosome, that's your DNA. it's not usually in that sort of a configuration. That happens when you have cell division.
So the idea I'm kind of getting, so I want you to correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but is that like this is the structure when the DNA is all packed up, like as if you're like moving from house to house or something, and it's like packed up, and then the cell divides or whatever, and then you unpack. Is that like a good way to think about it?
Yeah, for starters, I think it's so complicated and it's so dynamic that it may not fit nicely into such simple categories. But for starters, there is the kind of phase where it's working away in the cell, and then there's the phase where the cell is dividing, and it's got to support the cell division. But
so this all has to be unwound, like the parts that are going to be used to be transcribed have to be unwound or something, right? Like it won't be in this form.
Yeah. So first of all, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to get into too many details. And second of all, I'm not even sure how even the people who do understand this, how well it's understood. So what exactly happens when you have transcription and how the unwinding occurs, and I can't get into that level of detail, but it's complicated. Okay. But I will say that it happens best at the medium density regions in the nucleus, which is another huge complexity. Mm-hmm. So so what we described as the low level of structure here, the double helix and the nucleosome, how the nucleosome can move and so forth. And there's higher level structures that are important too. If we did this subject justice, it would take an entire podcast or hundreds of podcasts. So I just simply wanted to give a little idea of the genome and the complexity of the genome and what the DNA is doing in there. I have one other paper I'll quickly show you. Well, here, I'll finish up with this other paper first, a couple of quotes. These are just kind of apple pie quotes out of the paper to explain what they're doing. To understand how genomes work to process genetic information into biologically meaningful responses, it is critical to quantitatively map and mechanistically understand the physical organization of the genome relative to itself and to nuclear landmarks and bias. The key thing is their physical organization. It's the geometry, not the structure, not just the sequence. That's their point here. Don't get all hung up on just the sequence. Here's another similar quote. The goal of this project is to gain detailed insights into the 3D folding of the human genome at the resolution of functional elements in different cell states over time and in single cells, because it's different in different types of cells, skin, muscle, etc. That is to map the 4D nucleome, 4D, position and time, so that links between chromosome folding and genomic function can be derived. So it's really great stuff. This is the press release. DNA doesn't just sit still inside our cells. It folds, loops, and rearranges in ways that shape how genes behave. Researchers now have mapped this hidden architecture in unprecedented detail, showing how genome structure changes from cell to cell and over time. The study reinforces a growing view of what in genetics that reading DNA sequences alone is not enough. Sequence and structure. Sequence doesn't cut it. The physical shape of the genome also plays a central role. The physical shape. That's really important. Let me just show you a second paper here. This came from October, so it's also very recent. And they're showing at the top of this, the sequence. This is hundreds of kilobytes, this bar with the purple regions. And then it folds up into this, the spaghetti. And these distant parts can be closer together. Now, you might know that, 100 years ago, we discovered, genes and the genome and all that. And that was great. And then they discovered, genes sometimes there's a lot of space between the genes sometimes. What's that doing? What? And the ordering of the genes is kind of like, well, random or what? Why do we have this ordering? And then it's a kind of random ordering, it looks like. And then there's sometimes the genes themselves are cut up into multiple regions that are not together. And in between them, there are spacers. And they're called introns, intervening regions. So the part of the gene that's used to express the protein or the gene product is called the exon, expressed region, exon. And then the intervening regions are introns. And why are there these introns, and how do they arise? How do they evolve? Evolutionists could never figure out, did the introns come first or last, or what's going on here? Why are they there? Some genes don't have any. Some genes only have one. Some genes have a lot. Sometimes introns are short. Sometimes introns are long. It's like, this makes no sense at all. This is just all random. Yeah, it's evolution. Yeah, the biology is a claptrap. Nothing makes sense. It's just all random. It just happens to work. That's evolutionary theory. Well, what they're coming to in this paper is, maybe that's the reason for these introns and the intergenic regions, all the regions between the genes, is that when you fold things up in the genome, it all makes sense. We arrived at the novel hypothesis that the positioning of exons, introns, intergenic segments could encode packing information to generate nanoscale volumes in a sequence-independent manner. This proposes a crucial role for non-exonic DNA. Non-exonic, so the introns, the intervening, and then the regions between the genes, to act as volumetric DNA in complex multicellular eukaryotes to optimize chemical reactions. So it's all cutting edge. Nothing is known for sure here, but they're making sense of these things. The important point here, getting to your question earlier. Let me go back to this press release. The study reinforces a growing view in genetics that reading DNA sequences is what? Not sufficient alone. So if you talk to an evolutionist about this and you say, hey, the geometry and the structure and the positioning is like really, really important in biology. It's not just the sequence. They say, well, yeah, sure, of course. But that's all determined by the sequence. So the positioning, the geometry, it's all determined by the sequence. So ultimately, it all goes back to sequence.
Now, why do they say that?
Well, so so Archimedes said, "Give me leverage, and I'll move worlds." And Descartes said, "Give me motion and extension, and I will create the universe." Well, Epicurus and Darwin could have said, "Give me variation, and I will give you the world." In other words, they have to have variation. What if you didn't have variation? What if you did not have biological variation? Natural selection couldn't work on anything. You couldn't create all the things, the biosphere. How did the biosphere come about? How did you have the origin of life? How did you have, fish and amphibians and multicellular life and everything? Variation. You had to have random variation happening from which these things could occur. I know this is a long-winded answer, but I'm going to get there. So you had to have variation. So variation is metaphysically key. Why did they have to have variation? Because they didn't want to have God creating this world because it's so evil. So that's, we've gone all over that stuff, all the bad, all the theological reasons, but they needed a naturalistic explanation for the world. This isn't atheism, it's theism. So you have to have variation. So in biology, Darwin didn't have that. He could only conjecture how variation came about. So he created this whole theory and said, I'm not quite sure where the variation is coming from. 100 years later, that question was answered. It was genetics. It was genes and mutations and recombination. So you have these recombination events where genes can mix and match, and then you have mutations. Mutations, of course, originally created the genes. So mutations are crucial. So variation was finally had. Evolutionists had variation. So that was evolution version 2.0 in the mid 20th century, called the modern synthesis. or neo-Darwinism. You had variation. Give me variation, and I will give you the biosphere. That's what evolution could have said. And so, getting back to why is the sequence? So this leads to the idea that sequence is so important because it is doing it. Everything comes about by sequence. It's those mutations and recombination events in sequence that creates new sequences, and sequences, genetic sequences, are what create the world of biology. They created life. They created all the species. It was changing those sequences. You had to have variation. Epicurus, what was that? What was variation for the Epicureans? It was random motion, randomly swerving atoms. They call them randomly swerving atoms. For evolutionists, it's randomly mutating genes. And so this leads to this idea of king gene. The genes are in control of everything, but it's the gene sequence that's in control. The gene sequence is providing you with all of life. What about structure? What about geometry? That came from the sequence. Don't think of that as an independent design variable. That's not something that evolved on its own. The sequences create everything. So I just kind of a long-winded answer, but that's, why are they so keen on sequence? It's the king gene worldview that evolution embraces, that evolution mandates, that evolution promotes, because it has to have its own source of creation, a naturalistic source of creation, and that's mutations, and that's sequences. So sequences, it kind of stands at the top of the pyramid, and everything else just flows from it. So these findings is like, well, wait a minute. The genome is not just like some random structure stuffed into the nucleus and everything is driven by sequence. The structure is actually super important. And so an evolutionist would say to that, yeah, okay, sure, of course it's super important, but that's all determined by the sequence. The sequence does everything. Well, there's no scientific evidence for that. And what do you mean there's no scientific evidence? Of course there is. That's the way biology works. And so when they say that, they're revealing how much they are, their worldview is burned in. They've internalized evolution so much they can't think in other terms. So this is paradigm. The paradigm is so strong they can't realize, yeah, maybe sequence isn't what's driving everything. This structure could actually be its own, not determined by the sequence. So it's a very interesting finding. Now, what about the histones? So this is all background for this false prediction number 6, histone proteins. And it's interesting background. I hope people, who weren't aware of this stuff got kind of interested. It's like, wow, this is really cool. It's really, really interesting stuff. But it also is a way of explaining what are histone proteins. Because if I just dived into histone proteins right away, you wouldn't appreciate, well, what are they? What do they do? They are these proteins that form the nucleosome hub. And they have a tail. And the nucleosome hub can move. So they're really important, key, fundamental components of genomic structure in the nucleus. So it turns out that so they have an amino acid sequence. All proteins are made of a sequence of amino acids. They are roughly, a little more than 100 amino acids, so they're not real long. So you have this 100, 110, 120 amino acids, whatever. And you can compare that amino acid sequence in different species. Let's look at the histone proteins in humans. Let's look at the histone proteins in frogs. Let's look at them in single cell, ciliates. Let's look at them in whatever, right? Plants. And the typical finding in molecular biology is that you have differences. And the more different the species are, the greater the differences are in their protein sequences. Well, in histones, they're highly conserved. They are one of the most, if not the most, highly conserved sequences between species. Histone proteins are highly conserved across species. Here is a graph that you're not supposed to be able to read, a table, but it's showing a alignment between different species. On the left-hand side, there's about a dozen species, and the red and blue columns there, those are the amino acid abbreviations aligned, and they align very, very well. I'll blow that up a little bit, and you can see arginine, R. So at this position, you always find the same amino acid. Lysine, K. You find the same amino acid over and over and over again. These are very well preserved across radically different species, like I said, a ciliate in the human being. So this brings us to false prediction number 6. Histone proteins cannot tolerate much change. Why is that? So, by the way, here's another graphic of the nucleosome. This is an actual from an electron microscope, I believe, but you can see the DNA on the outer circumference wrapped around these histone proteins. Okay, so let me go back. Since you have all these different species with the same histone sequence, almost to within a few percent, they'll have a few amino acids that are different, but they're almost the exact same sequence of amino acids. Remember, the frog and the human have been evolving independently for a long time, like millions of years, right? Many millions of years they've been evolving independently. You would have random mutations happening under evolutionary theory. You would expect that those would then start to, morph the two different histone proteins. So the frog and the human have a common ancestor. From that common ancestor, that you have a histone 4, for example, a histone 4 protein that would be evolving independently. It should be accruing, drift. There should be amino acid changes in the one that are not in the other. So you should see differences. You're not seeing those. What does that tell you? If you are an evolutionist, that means those cannot be tolerated. Those changes, they lead to death. Your reproductive ability is gone, and so natural selection kicked it out. Almost the entire histone sequence is crucial, is necessary. You cannot change this hardly at all. That's
the prediction. That was the prediction.
From an evolutionary perspective, you have to conclude that, because over millions and millions of years, you would accrue, if there was any leeway, if there's any neutrality, it's like, it doesn't really matter if this is, a tryptophan or a tyrosine or a, leucine or isoleucine, or this can vary. Then you would see that, but you're not seeing it. So it must be crucial. You cannot change this sequence. And so let's go back to the histone proteins cannot tolerate much change.
And let me just try to summarize it and so that people make sure people are following. So under the evolution model, we all evolved from a common ancestor. And so then you get, as the tree spreads out, you get organisms on different parts of the tree that have massive differences in their genome. And you have massive differences in their morphology and everything because of the accumulation of mutations and natural selection. But when we look at these histone proteins, we don't see much change there. They're like the same in all the branches of the tree, almost very little change. And so how is that explained by evolution? Because hey, there's like hundreds of millions to a billion years or more that these things could be changing, but they're not. So the evolutionary answer is they can't change because these histone proteins are so vital in their structure just the way they are. If they get mutations, it's game over for that organism. So the histone proteins don't change.
That's 99% right. I want to add just a little bit of color. At the very end, you said these histone structures are so crucial in their structure, they cannot change. It's not just the structure, because you can change the sequence of a protein. You can go in and change a leucine to an isoleucine at a particular position in the amino acid sequence. And it's a good chance the structure won't change. So you can make sequence changes to a certain degree without changing the structure. So what this tells you, this incredible conservation of histones, is that it's not merely the histone structure, but it's the very sequence itself is so picky. It is so incredibly picky that it can't tolerate, a little bit of change. I can't have any salt here on my meat. I'm gonna, can't have it. It's gonna be perfect. It's gonna be just the way it is. No changes at all, because usually when we look at proteins, we're very used to seeing, oh yeah, you can make changes, and after you make a few changes and things start to break down, but you can make one or a few changes and things don't change that much. That's usually what we're used to seeing with proteins, and you see, so it's just kind of unusual that, like, wow, this is so intolerant of change.
But evolutionists need this to be true, because if it's not true, then they don't have an explanation for why these are conserved.
Right.
Why they're so similar.
From an evolutionary perspective, it is not only natural, but it is necessary. Mm-hmm. The histone proteins simply cannot tolerate change. You cannot have significant change. There's a whole bunch of amino acids that simply cannot, even just one of them cannot change. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from a couple of textbooks expressing the prediction. This is a leading textbook, undergraduate level molecular cell biology textbook. The amino acid sequences of 4 histones are remarkably similar among distantly related species. So this means that they evolved, albeit the similarity in sequence among histones from all eukaryotes indicates that they fold into very similar 3-dimensional conformations, which were optimized. I love that. Which were optimized for histone function. Did you know that evolution optimizes things? Early in evolution, in a common ancestor of all modern eukaryotes. Well, we now know it actually goes back earlier than just the eukaryotes. But the point here is, it did not happen kind of, lately or in recent evolutionary history. It had to, because it's in all the different species, it had to evolve early in evolutionary history. So that's just, tuck that away. Keep that in mind. It had to evolve early. Arose early in evolutionary history. Since their origin, there has been very little change because they're all the same. Now, here's another leading textbook, 1994. Changes in amino acid sequence are evidently much more harmful for some proteins than for others. Virtually all amino acid changes are harmful in histone H4. That's the most conserved of the histones. We assume that individuals who carried such harmful mutations have been eliminated from the population by natural selection. Now, here's the next version of that same textbook. This is 2002. This strong evolutionary conservation suggests that the functions of histones involve nearly all of their amino acids, so that a change in any position is deleterious to the cell. Yeah, so they all have some sort of function going on. It's a very interesting problem here. Now, this is a more popular rendition. PBS, WGBH, they did a big thing on evolution. This is 2001. Virtually all mutations impair histones' function so that none get through the filter of natural selection. The 103 amino acids in this protein are identical for nearly all plants and animals. Okay, so false prediction number 6. I just wanted to kind of clarify that and make sure everyone understands. This was clearly stated by evolutionists. Histone proteins cannot tolerate much change. I'm not just making it up myself, although I think it's clear that that is a necessary prediction of evolutionary theory. Okay, here is a paper from 2012. Despite the extremely well-conserved nature of histone residues throughout different organisms, only a few mutations on the individual residues bring about prominent defects, prominent phenotypic defects. In other words, we're trying this, we're mutating these amino acids at the various positions in the primary sequence, and it's not doing anything. It works just fine, actually. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. Here's another paper. It is remarkable how many residues in these highly conserved proteins can be mutated and retain basic nucleosomal function. The high level of sequence conservation of histone proteins across phyla suggests a fitness advantage of these particular amino acid sequence during evolution. Yet, comprehensive analysis indicates that many histone mutations have no recognized phenotype. That's weird. Nothing is changing. That is a obvious, clear, black and white falsification of a prediction. Now, what is the outcome? So we have a prediction. We have a falsification. What do we say about that? What happened? What's the denouement? What did evolutionists do? Did they find a smoking gun? That's what you want. That led to new knowledge. It led to some great new breakthrough. We had this problem, but we discovered a new planet. So here is a paper by Michael Behe, out of Michael Behe's lab. It's also like the last two that we just looked at. It's the same thing. It's just another falsification. That's all this is, except one little twist. So first, let's look at the falsification. Yeast histone H4 has been mutagenized at several positions which participate in the globular core of the nucleosome. The native protein contains residues at those positions which are what? Invariant or highly conserved over all known H4 sequences, whether from yeast, tetrahymena, which is a ciliate, single unicellular eukaryote, or higher eukaryotes. So, okay, just kind of restatement. Yeah, hey, look, we did this. Nonetheless, the protein is tolerant of non-conservative mutations. In other words, it didn't do anything, just what we saw. At the level of cell function, the mutant proteins cause no significant change in length of the cell cycle, of mating efficiency. At the level of chromatin structure, no effect is observed. Blah, blah, blah. So, okay, why am I pointing this one out? I want you to notice what the date is. 1990.
I looked at that. Yeah, it's 1996.
Yeah, you saw that. Very good, Rebecca. Yeah. Because the other ones I showed you were from much later, like 2012, 2010, something. Now, what were the dates of these other quotes I gave you that were stating the prediction, stating the
2002, after we knew that they were.
This is not just stating a prediction, it's stating a fact. It's like, okay, this cannot be tolerant of change. And the WGBH PBS 2001. What's my point here? Evolutionary dogma supersedes empirical science. It didn't matter that there was a paper out. It didn't matter that they were already showing it. That was swept under the rug. It's an abuse of science. It doesn't react well to false predictions. Evolution has to be true. And that's metaphysics. That's not science. And so therefore, the science will be jammed, will be forced into that template. And when you have predictions that don't fit, that's brushed under the rug. Right? So
now we're here 20 years later. So what are they saying now?
It's all just forgotten history. So what? Evolution is true. Don't worry about Philosopher Imre Lakatos talked about this, that the non-falsifiability of scientific theories and how they're protected. Scientific theories are protected. So Popper was before Popper you had the verificationists. So the logical positivist who said, what is science? How can you define science versus like poetry? And they said, well, verification. In order for something to qualify as science, it has to be verifiable. And that claim was called the verifiability principle or something like that. Well, the verifiability principle itself was not verifiable. So it was self-defeating. So then Popper came along and said, it's not verifiability, it's falsifiability. In order to qualify as science, it has to be falsifiable. Well, then Lakatos came along and said, no, that doesn't work either. That would disqualify all kinds of things that we think of as science. That science operates actually in the opposite way. It actually avoids falsifiability. It actually protects itself against falsifiability. Scientific theories are not falsifiable. And that fits evolution real well. Okay. Now, moving on, what other outcomes do we have? You asked about what they say today. So consider two outcomes. First, let's say, so they were searching for what's going to happen when we mutate these amino acids. Is there going to be a problem? Is there a functional constraint? Like I cannot change this isoleucine to anything else, or else the organism just dies. So there's a functional constraint. And then they discovered, no, we're not finding functional constraints. By the way, let me just interject. There was a time years ago in private discussions with an evolution professor who is a professor at a top tier research school. This guy is not any schmuck. This is a leading, very smart guy. And I got into this discussion with him. How do you get at evolutionary theory? How do you get at it? How do you falsify it? Because I don't think anything can falsify it. You can't get at it. It's like Lakatos said, there's a protective belt. And he said, no, you can falsify it. Oh, really? How's that? Well, if you found anything that was not functionally, if there, basically he described the situation we have here with the histones, where you don't have any changes, you don't observe any, there's high conservation where it's not necessary. High conservation is not necessary. Yeah. Which, by the way, comes out of the principle of plenitude, which we've talked about. This goes back to plenitude, but so it is metaphysical. But that's exactly what we have here. So, by the way, I just wanted to throw that in. That here's a case where a private. I'm not going to give the guy's name because it's private discussion, but he made this very clear. He's like, no, of course it's falsifiable, and he described exactly what we have found. And histones is not the only example of this, by the way. There are other examples as well. But here's an example where it's not functionally constrained. At least it doesn't appear to be. Now, he could argue, well, we just haven't discovered it yet. Right? And that's true. We haven't. But according to today's science, so I go by today's science, not by promissory notes. What we know today is it doesn't fit. So let's look at these two possibilities. Let's look out to the future, and let's allow the evolution professor to dream about what might happen. Let's look at these two possibilities. One, we don't find any functional constraints. More and more research is done. That's the case today. They haven't found these functional constraints on these conserved residues. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is we do find some. Maybe the professor is right. Yeah. Someday we discover, oh, here's why they are, the same. There's when you change them, when you mutate it, bad things happen. It's going to be subtle, because we haven't found them yet, right? So it's going to be subtle. Maybe it happened in very rare conditions, under certain environmental conditions, or under certain situations, certain scenarios, it's bad. Okay, those are two possibilities that could happen, right? Well, what if it's number one? I'm going to handle each one here. So for number one, what if it's number one? Well, that's not very good, because that's a fault. You've got a false prediction. So, okay, that didn't work out very well. That's what we just found. That's where we are right now. We're at number 1. But what if number 2 comes true? It's hard to see how that could have evolved. If it's rare, if it's only under certain conditions, then how could this protein, how could the histones have evolved? Because they're not necessary most of the time. You already are in early evolution. You already have limited time windows over which you have to evolve these histone proteins. Now you're going to say it's a very rare scenario, a rare condition. So either, you see, evolution has dug itself into a hole. Either outcome is bad. So that's an outcome of this false prediction, is you don't really have a good outcome, and you don't have a smoking gun. You don't have new knowledge being discovered. You're just kind of stuck with, okay, let's sweep it under the rug.
Well, they're going to say, oh, but you see, we have so much other evidence for evolution that doesn't really matter. Yeah, we can't explain that, but there's just so much other evidence.
Right. And so that gets to the higher level discussions of, okay, we're looking at false predictions. Do you agree that we have a false prediction? Okay, good. Let's move to the next one. Let's move to the next one. Let's move to the next one. So we got all these false predictions, dozens and dozens of fundamental predictions, unequivocal, black and white, no question about it, and they were falsified. Okay, we got that straight? Okay, good. Because this is the scientific language, the language of science. It's a universal language. We can all agree on this. It's not controversial. We don't have to get heated. No arguments, just objective discussions. And so now we've got dozens and dozens of false predictions. What did you say about all this other evidence? Show me one evidence that proves evolution that is scientific, because there are tons of evidences that prove evolution, and evolutionists are not shy about this. It's in the literature, but they are not scientific. They rely on theological premises. So let's just stick to the science. Where's all the evidence? And what you find out is, when you parse this out and you actually get into the details, you don't have all this evidence and mountains of evidence. The mountains of evidence you have are weak. It is true there's mountains of evidence, like, oh, we have a heart and chimpanzees have a heart, and evolution predicts that. Okay, good. That's evidence for evolution. It's not strong evidence. It's not compelling evidence. It's like, yeah, okay, it's evidence. There's tons of evidence that the world is flat, but I don't believe the world is flat. There's tons of evidence that the Earth is the geocentrism. Earth is at the center of the universe, but I don't believe it's false. So you could have tons of evidence that is not strong evidence. It's not the preponderance. It's not compelling. And so you do have a lot of evidence for evolution that is just weak. But there's also very powerful evidences for why it's a fact and why it's true. Those are always not scientific. And so people confuse those distinctions, and they say, oh, there's all this evidence. Okay, let's just categorize it and think logically about it. And this is not. We don't have to get it. I have nothing against evolution being true. That's not the point. I just want to go by the science. So that's
and I do. We've talked about it before, and people resist this idea very strongly about these are metaphysical or theological, pieces of evidence that are given for evolution. People resist that very strongly.
Yeah, because you're over the target at that point.
So, and it took me a long time to even see what you were talking about with that. So if anybody's watching and you don't understand what is this guy talking about with these like metaphysical claims and everything, I do recommend reading his books. It took me both of his Science's Blind Spot and Darwin's God to start to get this. And I still don't know if I fully get every aspect of it, but I'm starting to get it now. I'm starting to see it. So it's really important, because you'll realize that like Dr. Hunter says, the strong evidence for evolution is not scientific. It is theological, which is very weird to think about, but it seems to me to be true.
Yeah, it's a mind blow, because we've been fed the opposite. So it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around that. So that's why I'm writing papers on this to get this out.
I also wanted to say one thing about the heart thing, because you said, okay, a chimpanzee has a heart, a human has a heart, and so that's evidence for evolution. But what I've also noticed is that evolutionists don't let there be evidence against evolution. So if they find evidence that hearts have separate ancestry, meaning they're not morphologically or genetically similar, and so they had to evolve separately, they don't let that count against evolution. So,
Right.
And they do say hearts evolved at least 3 times. So
Right.
you have 3 separate evolutions of these incredible structures that pump blood, that distribute, that we absolutely depend on to get, nutrients to our cells every minute. And so these things amazingly evolved multiple times, and they don't let that count as evidence against common ancestry.
Yeah. So there's a kind of a having it both ways element.
Yes.
Where it's like, well, wait a minute. If it was evidence for evolution, when you have this and when it falls into a common descent pattern, so you say, oh, well, that's really good evidence for evolution. Okay, well then when it doesn't fall, when it contradicts the evolution, the common descent pattern, then that should be a falsifier then. No, just evolve that. That's convergence. So when and philosophers are all over this, when you always have an explanation for things, then your theory is breaking down. It's a tautology. Whatever we find, it's evolution. And that just gets to the fact that, we already believed in evolution to begin with. And the real proof and the real truth of evolution was in the arguments for why it's true to begin with. That's the power of evolution, and those are metaphysical. And it's so often, like you read Darwin's book, it's chock full of these arguments, but it's not that easy to perceive it unless if you're not a philosopher or historian. If you're just like reading this, he doesn't use the G word. He doesn't talk about God. He'll go on and on and on about scientific details, and then he'll say, so clearly it is utterly inexplicable on independent creation. That was one of his favorite phrases. It's utterly inexplicable on independent creation. Oh wow. So yeah, evolution must be true. If it is utterly inexplicable and independent creation, then yeah, I agree, evolution is true. But how do you know it's utterly inexplicable on independent creation? You know that because you have doctrines and traditions about God, the attributes of God, that you are holding dearly. So those are underwriting the entire argument. And that's no different with today's literature. It's stayed the same. They use different terminology, but it persists. So let me finish up here. Next, the histone's highly conserved sequence contradicts protein. Oh, okay. So one last denouement, one last outcome. We talked about how the histone proteins must have, according to evolution, the histone proteins must have evolved early in evolutionary history, because they're all through the eukaryotes and the archaea, so they had to go way back early in evolutionary history. That's when histone proteins evolved. So you don't have a lot of time. Secondly, we talked about how they're all the same, and so histone evolved originally and then never changed. They could not tolerate change, so they never changed. So that raises the question, wait a minute, then how did they evolve in the first place? They cannot tolerate change going forward. They could not tolerate change going backward either then. How could you evolve a protein, a histone, from random sequences or some other sequences and you got closer and closer to the histone? Remember, it has to be gradual. Evolution is a gradual process, one mutation at a time or 2 mutations at a time. So you're building up this sequence. That's not going to work. We just found out that there's no sign of a gradual pathway to a histone protein. What we see is a cutoff, a cliff. It's like, it's like Wile E. Coyote going off the cliff. You can't. It's not going to work if you meander too far from the native structure.
Well, then can't they say, well, before they evolved, like on the way to evolving, they were able to change, but then once they got to their current structure, they just stopped. They couldn't after that.
Right. And so that gets to what we said earlier about there's always an explanation. Like, but this, Antony Flew wrote this. He's a philosopher. He wrote this story about a gardener who was out kind of in the woods. And he said, look, there's a garden. No, there was a guy who said, there's a garden out in the woods, a really cool garden. And so he takes his friend to look at the garden. And he says, well, where is it? Well, it's right there. Look through those trees. Well, okay, let's get closer. Well, I still don't see it. Where is it? Well, it's right there, but see that bush? And so he's seeing something that is not there, and he always has an explanation. And he says, well, that just grew up. That bush just grew up recently, but that wasn't there before. And the garden is right there, but there's nothing there. Well, and you always have an explanation. So if you are a proponent of a theory, of a worldview, the philosophers understand this. You can always explain things if you want to badly enough. If you're sufficiently motivated, you can always come up with an explanation for the flat Earth and for whatever. So what you just said is a great example of like, okay, so histones can't tolerate any change, hardly. How did they evolve in the first place? There's no sign of a gradual pathway. Yeah, but this was, 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion years ago, things were different then. And so you could have had a world, and you could have had scenarios where there were meaningful sequences that led to the histone sequence. And they all had functional fitness contributions. And then you got to the histone sequence, and then it was frozen from then on. See, so it's just such a magical, just so story that you can always come up with explanations. And then from then on, it was just this incredible machine that was supported what we talked about earlier. The whole genomic story and how the structure of the genome is precisely packed into the nucleus. Oh yeah, well, the histone is critical for that, but it just happened to evolve by some other means, but fulfilling other purposes that just happen to be that. So the serendipity is off the charts. There's no parsimony to this theory, and there's no evidence for it. It's just all just so stories and speculation, but it has to be true. It's a fact.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even we're nitpicking with the false predictions. Even just when you try to think about these histone proteins themselves, what these actually are, and you think about what it would take for mutations, blind mutations, and natural selection to be able to get these machines, molecular machines, to, first of all, you need the bits of information to build them. You need all the machinery in place to build them. Once they get built, they have to know their job. They have to know, and I don't know where the knowledge is, but and it could be a chemical basis, but there has to be, these histone proteins have to bind together and then work together in concert with all these other molecular machines.
Concert. That's a key thing. Because remember, a few minutes ago, you asked about where's the knowledge, and I talked about, there's this huge context in which it works. There's these hormonal signals or nerve signals or whatever, all these other machines working, that it's within the context of that. And so it's in concert with so many other things. You can't just evolve a histone protein and have that like, oh, okay, that's going to start right. So you have to have all this stuff building up together at the same time and having all these intermediate states that work. The parsimony is just not there. Just the serendipity is ridiculous. Yeah.
Yep.
So
did you have more you wanted to say about that?
Let me see here. Okay, no, I didn't. That's the end. Religion drives science and it matters. So
can you talk a little bit about that? What does this mean? Religion drives science and it matters. Because when I first heard you say this, I thought you meant something different than what you really mean.
Yeah. And so it's good to, first of all, have a little bit of understanding of when we talk about theological arguments for evolution. And I'll just give one, this so people can kind of get it under their belt. But there's more than a dozen. And I've documented these in my channel and on writings. But I'll give one, which is theological utilitarianism. And in chapter 6 of Origins, Darwin stated that he is a theological utilitarian, and his theory is staked to theological utilitarianism. Now, he was clever with his word. You have to read the paragraph a couple of times to figure out what he's saying, because he's used kind of some double negatives and stuff like that. But he states this in chapter 6. You can find it if you search on utilitarianism. That only occurs a few times in Darwin's book. And then shortly after that paragraph, he then proves evolution to be true because of bad designs, of designs that are not maximizing usefulness or utilitarianism. And one example he uses is the webbed feet of a bird that doesn't go in the water or is not near the water. So birds that have webbed feet that are in the water, that makes sense, right? Because they swim in the water and they're paddling in the water, so they would have webbed feet. That would make sense. But there's birds that are, there's an upland goose, for example, that is not typically found in the water or near the water, and it has webbed feet. Now, to you and I, and to people today, you may go, so what? What's the big deal? But if you're trying to seriously reckon with the idea of creationism, which they didn't use that word back then, but and that God created these things, these are creations of God, why would the upland goose have webbed feet? And the answer is, God didn't do that. It would have come about by inheritance. And Darwin says that explicitly. We may safely infer inheritance. That comes a couple of paragraphs after he said, there are those people like Adam Sedgwick, one of his mentors, those people who are not utilitarians. They say that God can create for other reasons, like beauty, harmony, stuff like that, non-functional reasons, non-materialistic reasons. Darwin will have none of it. He said, if that's true, my theory is absolutely false, demolished. He stakes himself hard, real hard, to theological utilitarianism. The world must be a utilitarian world. If there are things that, if God can create things that, according to non-material, non-functional criteria, like beauty, then you can toss my theory out. He's making a very clear, undeniable, black and white statement of a religious belief.
Now, is the reason for that, was that the general philosophical thinking of the time? Was that the prevailing view? Is that, the cultural environment that he was in?
It definitely was. There's a kind of long history to it, and it's not a black and white answer. It's kind of like, gray area. But yes, utilitarianism in general is very seductive and attractive. And it came about a century earlier with theories of ethics. And so, which was an outcome of deism and earlier soteriology and theological questions. But so you had the theory of ethics come about of utilitarianism. You maximize happiness. It's the happiness principle. You maximize happiness. And then it jumped ship to natural theology. And so some natural theologians did argue, yes, exactly what you're saying, Roka, that one of them, William Paley, who was by far the most famous, the most popular, prolific natural theologian in Darwin's time. And Darwin read Paley, as all young students in England would read Paley. He read Paley, he liked Paley, and he had no problem with Paley as a young man. And he picked up on utilitarianism. But yeah, of course, I mean, a good Englishman believed that the world would be created for the good of our lives, of enhanced function, enhanced material good, just like England was an economic machine that was using resources and churning out products and so forth, running the show. That's what God does with the world. It's of course it's materially functional. You don't find things that don't work right, that don't look right. If you do, God did not make that. So yeah, it fits into the culture, no question about it, and that's been written about in many historians. But it's a little bit tricky because there also were plenty of natural theologians who disagreed. And in fact, they called out William Paley and they said, no, Paley is, he's wrong. He's a good guy. He made a lot of good points, but we disagree with his utilitarianism. He went off the rails when he did that. So yeah, there was internal debates and there was discussions about this. These guys were smart people, and they knew what they were talking about. And Darwin made it real clear. He rejected Sedgwick and those others who were advocating a non-utilitarian view of creation. And so that's a huge concept that needs to be understood, because this wasn't by no means restricted to the 19th century Englishman, right? It's very well alive today. And
that's what I was going to ask you. Can you give an example of how people are still using this utilitarianism without realizing it? Like they don't realize it, but it's embedded in. And also I want to let the chat know, I'm going to get to your comments soon. Thank you for your comments. And then we also have one more topic to discuss. So I'll let you give your example. Can I take down the slides? Is it?
Yeah.
Or you need it up still?
Yep.
Okay.
Take down the slides. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So, I could talk about, I'll give some examples from evolution, but also creationists. So creationists typically are also theological utilitarians. They come from the same background as the evolutionists do. They believe the same thing. There's no difference. And that's why it's so important to understand that there's no, where it counts, evolution and creationism are the same thing. And that because the theology is what counts. That's what's driving things. That's my view. That where they diverge, obviously they diverge. They believe different things. Creationists believe God created the world, but it's all tainted by their underlying metaphysics of their doctrines of God, which are non-biblical, by the way. And so the evolutionists are also believing the same thing. So, for example, I've seen creationist material on viruses. Why are there viruses? Well, there's actually good things about viruses, and that's what God was getting at. And they got corrupted by the fall. So that's always kind of the story: is that the world is perfect and good, corrupted by the fall. And so God never does anything that violates theological utilitarianism. On the evolution side, I mean, it's all through the literature, the apologetics literature for why evolution is a fact. One would be Jerry Cohn. He talks his why evolution is true. He's got a bunch of examples in there of this doesn't look right, this doesn't work right. Sometimes it's just it doesn't look right. So it may work perfectly fine, but it doesn't look right. And so that's not utilitarianism, that's dysteleology. Like, I don't like the way this is designed. And Richard Dawkins makes that argument about our retina. The photoreceptor cells appear to be inverted. Well, it works okay, but I don't like this. It just doesn't look right. No good engineer would do it that way. So that's not utilitarianism, because he's admitting it works right. So that's dysteleology. Utilitarianism is it actually doesn't work as well. So you see there's fine distinctions between these different arguments. There's evil, there's dysteleology, there's utilitarianism, and the other different little flavors to them. But they're all.
This is really another interesting thing that you opened my mind to, because it blew my mind when you started talking about how you're not a creationist because of they're the same as evolutionists. It's the exact same.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is he talking about? Like, to me, these are so different. But when I started listening to your explanation, I was like, oh, I see what he means. They're all making excuses for God. They're just doing it they're making the same types of excuses. They're just, the creationists are leaning on the fall, and the evolutionists are leaning on this is
natural process.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you could say making excuses for God. You could also say protecting God. So I wouldn't say making excuses. I would say they're not making excuses for God. They're protecting him. They're making sure.
I'm guilty of this, by the way. But I've started to simmer down on that. I started to just let God be God,
Right.
So anyway,
I'm not even saying all of these claims are necessarily false. I think we can think God's thoughts after him. We can read scripture. We can learn about the attributes of God. And sometimes maybe they are true. But just to be sure, they're not science. It's not a scientific theory. It's a religious theory. And the creationists will come right out with it and say, yeah, it's a religious theory. So you got to give them credit. They're admitting what they are. Whereas evolutionists are insisting, no, they have this cognitive dissonance where they claim to be a scientific theory and just empirically driven, and then turn right around and make all kinds of religious claims that they don't recognize as being religious. Because no, it's just a science. So there's plenty of examples. Those are a couple of examples. Jerry Cohen's book is a great example of. I think one of them was this flat fish that has like the eye, like two eyes on the same side of the fish. Have you seen that example? It's this fish with two eyes on the same side of the fish. It's like, what? This doesn't make any sense. They're supposed to have eyes on the opposite sides. And it actually migrates from one side to the other during the development of the fish or during its lifetime. And Cohen just has a great time with that and just ridicules how like this is like so ridiculous. Like there's no designer would ever do this. This is like totally absurd. Well, he may be right, he may be wrong, but he's not scientific. That's not a scientific argument. Like there's no scientific experiment you could do to learn what his claims are true. These are metaphysical claims. They're religious claims. They're theological claims. Call them what you want. They're not science. And those are the heavy-duty, powerful claims that make evolution to be true. As I said, there's a lot of arguments for evolution, a lot of evidence for evolution. Some of them are very weak. It's like the flat Earth arguments, very weak. There's tons of those. There's also tons of arguments that are very powerful that do prove evolution to be true, no question about it, but they entail religious premises.
Now, people are confused, I think, when you say that do prove evolution to be true. Like, can you clarify that? Because I know you don't believe evolution to be true. You're saying if these things that they are presenting are true, then evolution would be true.
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. When I say prove it to be true, it's a valid argument. That is that the conclusion is a necessary consequence of the premise. So it's valid in that sense. It proves, but it's 100% reliant on the premises. So it's a valid argument. Is it a sound argument? An argument is sound if the premises are true. If the premises are not true, it's not sound. And so then it fails to prove the conclusion. And so the question of whether it's true or not, that becomes a metaphysical question, because these are metaphysical claims. It's not a scientific question. And so I can't answer that because that gets into metaphysics. What I can say is that they're not biblical. And so you go outside. So that brings me to the next topic.
Okay, let's just go to that, and then we'll do the comments at the end. So
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
It's a good segue. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the question that sometimes comes up, and I think people are still confused about this, is does the Bible support or allow for evolution? And I wanted to address that just because, people are still confused about that. And the problem is there's two questions at play, and people don't realize it. They think there's one question. There's actually two, and they get these, confused, and they're both kind of dancing around and people are thinking. But people who ask the question, does the Bible allow for evolution? And people who answer the question don't understand, don't cleanly distinguish these two different questions at play. So the one question is, so evolution says the species arose naturally. Does the Bible support that? Or the world arose naturally? Does the Bible allow for that? Okay, fair question. Perfectly fair question. What it means is, could God have created everything by secondary causation, but by his natural laws? Does the Bible allow for that? Okay, well, we can have that discussion. That's a fair question. That gets into the who, what, where, how, when. Was it 4,000 years ago, as Bishop Usher said, or whatever he said? Was this a miracle, or was it a natural law at play? What happened here when on day 3? You can have that discussion, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But that's the one question at play. The second question at play is, because evolutionists say it's a fact. Evolution is true beyond all reasonable doubt, however you want to put it. And they say that because of these religious arguments, these theological arguments. Oh, so there's theological arguments? Yeah, there's theological arguments entailed by evolution. Darwin's book was chock full of theological arguments. Today's contemporary evolution literature is full of theological arguments. Oh, really? Yeah, well, are they biblical? Aha, that's the other question. Does the Bible allow for evolution? Well, the one question deals with natural secondary causes. Could God have used secondary causes? The other one is, does the Bible allow for those religious claims that are in Epicureanism and evolution and creationism? Does the Bible support or allow for those religious claims? Because those are crucial to evolutionary theory. They are what mandate evolutionary theory. That's why we've heard of Charles Darwin. That's why he's a thing. That's why evolution is a thing, because of the religious claims that they make. That's all through the literature. So does the Bible allow for that? Or does the Bible allow for God using secondary causes? Strictly secondary causes. Those are two totally different questions. But when you get people talking about this, they're often thinking of the first one. Oh, well, could God have, could Genesis be interpreted as naturalistic causes?
And your answer to that is?
I will give that, but I just want to say,
okay.
Dancing around in the background, always in these discussions, is the second question. So you get they get conflated, because people are, well, but are you saying that God, so all of a sudden they're bringing in the second one. That's where all the power is. So on the first one, I will say, first of all, it's not something that I generally think a lot about, and I've never been a creationist. I've never really been into this stuff. I don't really care if God used evolution. I'm perfectly fine if Jesus used evolution and secondary causes to create the world. Fine, it doesn't float my boat. I'm not a big deal to me. And when I read scripture, I'm not a theologian, not a professional at this, but I do find there's certainly verses that sound a lot like evolution to me. Let the earth bring forth in Genesis 1, right there. Like, that sounds a lot like evolution to me. A day is as 1,000 years. Okay, that sounds like an old earth. David Snopes has written a book on the old earth, on why he thinks. Let me be very clear about this. David Snopes, in his book, he's not saying the Bible allows for old earth. He's not saying that. He's saying the Bible is stating an old earth. He's making a much stronger claim. He's saying the best interpretation of scripture is that the earth is old. He's not saying, well, science shows the earth is old, so therefore I'm going to twist scripture and I'm going to try and fit scripture. And no, that's not what he's saying. David Snopes is saying the best interpretation of scripture is an old earth. Now, you can argue with him one way or the other, but there's a pretty smart guy coming to a pretty interesting conclusion. So those sorts I'm making arguments that I think it's okay for God to have used secondary causes. There could be enough time for secondary causes. And there's certainly plenty of scripture passages that are pointing that God is using secondary causes. He's not using primary causes to get things done. But so that's my basic answer is like, I think the Bible does support evolution or allow for evolution. However, I do want to kind of clarify, I think it's a weak interpretation. I do think it's a stretch. The more I think about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, you're really kind of pushing it. There are some other passages in scripture that it's really hard to get around and to have a full-blown evolution. That's pretty weak. But I don't go all the way because I'm not dogmatic, or I don't think the Bible is dogmatic. And if I don't sentence it's crystal clear, if there's some problems, or there's some not problems, that there's different ways of interpreting something, then I back off. I don't want to hold to a position that I can't say that scripture is real hard and fast on. So my answer is, I think that the Bible allows for evolution, but I will say, I mean, it is stretching the envelope. You're pushing the envelope. It's really kind of a stretch. It would be very interesting. So I don't think it's 50-50. I'm not saying the Bible is just totally neutral on the subject. I think it is a weak interpretation. I'm just not ready to go there and say, well, yeah, it has to be that creationism, the evolution has to be false. I'm just not ready to go there.
If you found out evolution was true today, you would work it out theologically.
Right. I wouldn't have I wouldn't burp on that. But the reasons why I really think it's boring, banal, almost I would say trivial, ridiculous, whatever words I can think up here. I think that sense of the question, that first question is, I'm not interested at all in going there. And even thinking of spending too many cycles on that is just a waste. And I'll give you two reasons. One is, it is so obvious and clear from a scientific perspective that evolution fails badly, that why would I want to think about, well, maybe God used it? I would inevitably, like B.B. Warfield, would be forced to say, well, if he used evolution, he would have had to have gotten in there and manipulated it to make it work, because it's not going to work on its own. So then I'm back to creationism. I mean, okay, so what? No, he used naturalistic causes, but this is not evolution as stated. This is not the evolution that you were taught. This is a B.B. Warfield version of evolution, where it's driven by God and he's manipulating things. So it's just, that's not what evolutionists want. That's not what we think of as evolution when we use the word evolution. So why even go there? The other reason is the real reason people are evolutionists, and the real reason why people believe in evolution is the religion, the theological claims, which brings us to the second sense in which the question is asked: does the Bible allow for evolution? The sense that I believe is the important sense, the sense that matters, that is the one that is doing the heavy lifting in the public square, in our discourse, in our debate. The one that really counts is the theological claims: utilitarianism, probable evil, probabilistic teleology, plenitude, God of the gaps, intellectual necessity, miracles. It's a dozen of these arguments that are tightly held and really strongly argued by evolutionists and creationists. And the evolutionists insist that evolution must be true. Those I'm absolutely kind of hard over. I am convicted. Those are non-biblical. They are outside of scripture. You can find.
Can you explain what you mean by that? Because people are not going to understand.
So,
what is non-biblical about saying God didn't create this evil thing, or God wouldn't have done it this way?
So I don't have my Bible around here, so I can't open it up. I'll just off the top of my head, Job 39:17. So in Job 39, God is surveying creation, and 38, 39, 40. and he's surveying creation with Job, and he's showing Job, the complexities and the awesomeness and everything, to put him in his place, to say, look, this is above your pay grade. Okay, you can't be cogitating and thinking about things above your pay grade. This stuff is, where were you when I cast the stars into their places? I think so. Okay, so he gets to the oracle, the ostrich in Job 39:17. He talks about the donkey before that. So I'll mention that also. And the donkey, he says, look at the, so he's telling Job, look at these things. Look at the stars. Look at the earth. It's so incredible. And he says, look at the donkey. Now, if I was God and I was trying to impress Job, I don't think I would bring up the donkey. What am I going to say about the donkey? Look at the donkey. It is so awesome. Well, what does he say about the donkey? He says, it ignores the shouts of the driver. Okay, that's I'm not so sure about that. Is that really a good thing? And then he moves on to the ostrich. And he says, look at the ostrich. She lays her eggs in vain, for they will be trampled. She doesn't guard them. She forgets about them. And they get trampled by other animals. They get trampled underfoot. They get killed. This is death and destruction. And then he said, and then God tells Job why. And what would you expect God to say? Well, because of the fall, because of natural laws, because of randomness, because of those swerving atoms, those mutations. This is why. It's all your fault, Job. No, he doesn't say that. He says, because I did not endow her with wisdom. God did not endow the ostrich with wisdom. That doesn't fit utilitarianism, theological utilitarianism at all. That is a refutation. That is a contradiction of theological utilitarianism. In fact, Darwin actually came across these ostrich eggs in South America when he traveled around the world in the HMS Beagle, 1830s. And he found exactly that. It's like, what the heck are all these ostrich eggs doing out here? They're going to get killed. And he actually talks about that in the book. And it's one of his arguments for evolution, and is that this isn't working. If he had been acquainted with Job 39, he might have realized, oh, I'm falling right into this trap. So that's one example. There's a lot of other examples like the subtleties, but what you said earlier, protecting God. You don't need to protect God. You don't need to make excuses for God. You need to be very careful about that. And so, to my reading of Scripture, all of the arguments that sound so good to us about, yeah, this is the way the world should be, you were thinking as men think, and not as God thinks, and it's not biblical. I don't want to get into a discussion of, is this right or wrong, where it's going to lead. I can object. I think most theologians, most people acquainted with Scripture, Christian theologians, where they land, would agree, yeah, these are non-biblical. Well, I guess I should take that back, because there are plenty of Christian theologians who are evolutionists. And so the question, why do they think these claims are biblical? How could they think that evolution is biblical? And my answer to that is they're not acquainted with the arguments for evolution. They are unaware of these deep theological claims of evolution and how it's Epicureanism.
Well, don't you think though like a lot of the philosophers, Christian philosophers, promote ideas about God and have like ways of describing God's character that, you know what I mean? Like the apologetics and things like that might also fall in line with the evolutionary scenario.
Yeah, but I think you can do it right and do it wrong. Like, you can use Scripture as your resource, because it does tell us things about the character of God and the attributes of God. So I do think there are plenty of Christian theologians and philosophers who do it right, or let me be more neutral, do it according to the Bible and consistent, aligned with the Bible. So you're not violating the Bible when you bring in arguments about the attributes of God. But when you start saying, well, God wouldn't create these ostrich eggs, okay, well, that's not biblical. So Isaiah 45:7, God creates evil. And I know when I teach that, usually some students who will disagree with that. No, it doesn't say that. Well, actually, it does say that. Now, the evil there is natural evil. It's not moral evil. So there's two categories of evil in philosophy, natural and moral. So we're talking about natural evil, like earthquakes and predation. These are terrible things. But it's not more. We're not talking about sin. So in Isaiah 45:7 is talking about natural evil. It's in the context of natural evil, at least, to put it that way. And he says he creates it. And the verb, that's what people will often argue is, no, he doesn't create it. You don't know, you don't understand how to read the Bible. It says allow. He allows for it. He's looking the other way. He's allowing these things to happen. No, actually, it doesn't say that. The verb is bara. That's I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but it's the verb that comes
same
out.
Word in Genesis, right?
Yeah.
Genesis 1.
Right.
Yeah.
Create bara. So it's right there. Now, there's other places in the Bible that suggest a tough love sort of a approach by God. So Lamentations talks about it. There's another verse I was looking at. I can't remember where it was. But, yes, I do these things, but it's for your own good. It's because it's trying to fix things. So, yeah, you can get into deeper discussions of why and how this works. And so that would kind of play into the fall. You sinned, so I'm doing this. So that would kind of play into the creationist argument that this is all because of the fall. Yes, God did it, but it's because of the fall. My reading of things of the Bible is God takes ownership of the world and the way that it is.
Awesome. Thank you.
But I'm not claiming, but by the way, I'm not claiming everything I'm saying is right or anything. I mean, these are complicated issues, and people have different views on these. I just want it to be clear when people are making religious arguments and when they're making science arguments. I'm kind of trying to protect science. Like, that's not science. Don't bring that into science. And that's what I see with the that's my main message here. I mean, we get off into these theological discussions, and it's not my expertise, but I do know a religious argument when I see it, and when I see it parading as a scientific argument in science.
Yeah, I have some more questions I want to ask you about that, but I'll put up the comments. So Mike says, "Hi, Rebecca and Cornelius. Looking forward to your presentation. Thank you. Hey, gorgeous Ruddy Chrome. Glad you made it." And wait, let me put up Wes. Hey, Wes. Glad to have you here. Frank says, "Good point about histones. They are examples of high conservation that is not necessary. That falsifies evolution. But according to Lakatos, what is it?
Lakatos. That's Emery Lakatos. That's the guy that it's a protection. He's good. Yeah.
Scientific theory protects itself from falsification."
Yeah.
Wesley says mountains of metaphysics. When you said mountains of evidence, mountains of evidence for evolution. He said mountains of metaphysics, bad logic, and he says if you have a bad ontology, you have a bad epistemology, then you have bad methodology.
Yeah, that's probably all true.
Wesley says naturalism is bad ontology.
Yeah. Yeah, but to be clear, I just want to be clear about this. So, it's very common. In fact, I just saw a Christian video a few days ago for evolution for Christians to attack atheism and to attack materialism, and that's the enemy. That's the low hanging. That's the red meat for Christians. Let's gotta kill atheism. And they also will attack naturalism often under the definition of atheism. That's what naturalism is. It's atheism. I don't think of naturalism as atheism. It's true, you can look up in your Webster dictionary, and that's one of the definitions. Naturalism is all there is natural things. There's no material, no spiritual world. But that's not the definition at play in the public square where it counts today. The more common, the more important definition of naturalism is the world arose by natural causes. It does not exclude God. It doesn't exclude a spiritual world. It doesn't. It is, and that's the argument for naturalism that's being made by evolutionists. Is the world arose naturalistically? We believe in God. We believe in a God who uses natural causes. Now, I agree with this. Naturalism is a bad ontology. I just want to make it clear that I'm using that definition of naturalism that I think is dominant in the public square, and that's what's important. And so I just want to
It includes God.
Yeah, I just want to send the warning out. It's so common to attack naturalism under the definition that naturalism is atheism. And I think that's a flawed. It's just, it's not that you can attack atheism all day long, fine, but it's not very important. Of course, atheism is false. It's ridiculous. It's vulnerable to all kinds of problems, but that only a very small percentage of the people are atheists, right? And even those who are atheists use religious arguments.
Yes.
They're not actually legitimate atheists. They disqualify themselves. Even Richard Dawkins, he's not an atheist.
But do you think that it's true what Richard Dawkins says? Because I believe this, that he said, evolution makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, where it's kind of like providing cover, it gets you, it gets God out of the picture. And if people want God out of the picture, I want them to be able to get rid of God, because I don't think God wants to force people into his kingdom. He doesn't want to, God is, he wants you to be as free as he made you, which is you're free to think and live, and, and he hopes that you will love him as he loves you. But, this idea like that, I want people to be able to have that, but one of my main drives for fighting evolution is that I think it takes away the best evidence people have for God's existence. Like the evidence he gave everyone. Like he gave us the ability to look around, and our natural instincts will be, look at that tree, look at that flower, look at that animal. These are things that God created. Look at myself. Look at my family. This is what God created. This is an obvious design. But evolution takes that away. And no. This is not design. It's not design. Right. It came about. And so and so it kind of takes away that general revelation.
Yep, I agree. I've thought that too. Yeah, that's one of the purposes probably of evolution, is to take away that revelation. And so in that sense, it's a spiritual attack. And so we're getting at the true, what's really going on behind evolution. But when people like Dawkins say, well, it allows you to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, I would say what he really, the truth behind what he's saying, or the more accurate way of saying his statement is, it allows me to be intellectually fulfilled theist, not atheist. Because when he makes arguments about God, he's showing that he's not an atheist. An atheist can't make arguments about God. He can only say, well, those people have this particular religious belief, and that religious belief is wrong. But that's not what he's saying. And atheists don't say that. They actually say, no, God these are the attributes of God, and therefore he doesn't exist. He didn't create the world, whatever. And so they're making claims that an atheist can't make. It's a cognitive dissonance. It's a very complicated dissonance that they because they're as it's not a good ontology to begin with, and so it gets into this confusing mess, and it's almost not worth trying to unpack it, but it's yeah.
Okay, so
there we go.
Bongo says evolution is a concrete fact. Even if you could prove there was a God, evolution is still a concrete fact.
Yeah, which is good. So it doesn't. God is not. He's not arguing from atheism, and so the challenge for 83 Bongo is give us one or two or three scientific evidences to back up what you're saying.
And Wesley responded to him and said, that's a category error. We're not talking about evolution as a law. We're talking about evolution as a theory, ontologically distinct claims which require different kinds of evidence.
I'm not sure what she's referring to.
Okay. Frank says, if evolution is a fact, then it is not a scientific theory. Facts can't be falsified.
Yeah, I mean, so I hate to be the defender of evolution and everything, and this gets into the kind of the fuzzy logic of science versus, say, like math or logic. In science, you have theories, and then if they work, I'm going to just kind of echo the party line here. You have theories, and if they work really, really well, and they're just shown they're all their predictions are true, and there's no evidence against it, and over and over and over again, then you finally get around to saying, well, it's a law or a fact. And I'm not so sure that's a problem. It's like the law, like thermodynamics or Newton's theories of physics, which were proven false by quantum mechanics, but false in only a very this subtle way. They still work for the majority of problems. So I'm kind of defending the idea that in science you can call something a fact, and even if that's philosophically sloppy and isn't quite right. What I'm saying is, if I want to give evolutionists the permission to do that, if they have the empirical goods, if it's true, if there are claims that there's just mountains of super compelling scientific evidence for this, I'm willing to go along with it. I don't want to create an argument against evolution that is philosophical or is nuanced or is I'm nitpicking. You made a philosophical mistake, therefore I'm going to disagree. No, I'm going along with it. I'm just looking at the science and the scientific claims and the scientific evidence.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Frank also said, good point. If histones can't tolerate change, then how did they evolve in the first place? And I think we talked about that. So
right, no, he's responding to what we said. It's it's not actually part of that false prediction number 6. It's more a part of false prediction number 5, which was protein evolution, but it comes right out of the histone story. And it's very powerful.
Wes says, as a model, all the serendipity makes it less plausible. If we're making an inference to the best explanation, which is the correct modus operandi, then we find that materialism and naturalism are false.
Okay, let me give you a different way of thinking about it, just for fun here. Here's the way I think about it. Evolution is man's origin story. So you got the Bible, you got God. Okay, we don't like that. We don't want God to be creating the world. We're going to come up with our own origin story. And it was Epicureanism at first, and then it morphed into Darwinism and evolution. So evolution is man's response. And it's driven by and mandated by theological claims. But then it appeals to science and tries to marshal the science to back it up. the science fails. So the science says, oh, we had these theological claims we thought were true. They made a bunch of implications of the real world, bunch of predictions. The science disproved them. We failed over and over again. So by modus tollens, the if must be wrong. So the if was, if God wouldn't do this, this, and this, if the character of God is this, if the attributes of God are this, such, then evolution would be true. Science shows us that evolution is false. It's been falsified over and over and over again. So therefore, by modus tollens, the religious claims, call it deism, or I call it theological naturalism, call it evolution, or whatever I want to call it. There's not a good word for it right now, but I call it theological naturalism. That must be false by modus tollens. So we've had like a 2,000-year test. We made an attempt. We made a religious theory, and it failed. And we can now say, of course, we could have said this hundreds of years ago, but we just have more and more evidence against it. So we now know it's a really good thing. We disproved deism and theological naturalism, and we can now go back to the scripture and Bible.
Okay, so Atmospheric Skull says you're welcome to abandon methodological naturalism if you like, but then scientists have no reason to hear you out.
Yeah, so by that reason, so methodological naturalism is one of the outcomes of the arguments against miracles. So there's a long history of cessationism and other arguments against miracles, and that resulted in methodological naturalism, although they didn't use that word at the time. That's kind of a more recent term. But the idea that science has to do its research by the assumption that everything is natural. So if that is so you obviously already, you want to pursue, you're defending methodological naturalism. We're not going to listen to you if you abandon that. So then you have no right to claim, you have no basis to claim that evolution is true or a fact, because you're mandating it from the beginning. You're saying, well, we're going to do science according to the assumptions of naturalism. We're going to we are only going to allow naturalistic explanations. Oh, okay, that's it. I do that too, by the way. I'm a methodological naturalist. I am a methodological naturalist. When I do science, I do it by methodological naturalism. But I realize that's just a method. I would not say, oh, therefore evolution is true, because I do science according to naturalism. I'm able to intellectually realize that just because I do science according to naturalism doesn't mean everything is naturalistic. That would be a illogical conclusion. You're muted.
Sorry, where are we? Okay, we're at Tom. A concert is a good description. Many musicians playing together to make music. When one musician started missing notes, when one musician starts missing notes, the cell will die.
Well, yeah, one thing I didn't talk about is the precision within the nucleus, the crazy level of precision. It's insane. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of protein machines in there that are working on the genome and the DNA, and it's got to be just right.
Okay, Roya says, hi, sister. Thank you. Good to see you. Frank says, good observation about utilitarianism, even among creationists. Thank you, Frank. Yeah. And he says, every one of us is primarily protecting our ideas of God as if God can't take care of himself.
Fair point, yeah.
And Tyler says, in regards to what he has been saying, what would convince anyone in science to take any of this seriously? Tyler,
so,
are you talking about the religious conversation that we've been having or the first part? Because you came in later. So we started out talking about science and then we kind of got off onto the, metaphysical claims of evolution.
But I want to allow, let's just think about this comment for a second and allow that. He's making a point, which is pretty negative, like why would, why would any scientist ever take any of this seriously? That shows the paradigm aspect that Kuhn talked about and how powerful that is, and how you can't expect a practitioner to go against his theory, and you can't expect rational thought and logic to win the day. Like I can explain, evolution fails on its predictions. So what? Tyler says, so what? All of its major predictions have failed. So what? Evolution makes religious claims, is driven by and motivated by theological claims. That's why it's claimed to be true. So what? So you see the protectionism, it's not vulnerable to rational, logical criticism and thought. Because why? Because it's a religious theory. Religion is not vulnerable to those things. And so Tyler thinks he's making a good point. You're defending, no one would pay attention to that. Yeah, right. Exactly. You wouldn't pay attention to that because it's religious. It's not a good thing. The statement here is not a good reflection on evolution.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly because we're at 2 hours. Iron Charioteer says, did God give me the free will to sin?
That's above my pay grade.
It seems to me he did, since people are, sinning and, they are doing that. So it seems that we do have the free will to sin. But of course, it could be determined if you're, if you believe in determinism. So R. Brown says that nature is designed, but nature is also riddled with design flaws. So the creator is a flawed designer.
So that is one of the 12, one of the dozen theological arguments. And when you say design flaws, that can be something that just doesn't look like it was designed. That would be teleology, dysteleology, or it doesn't work very well. That would be disutility. So it's going to fall into, or it could be evil, and that would be the problem of evil. So it's going to fall into one of those categories. But this is one of the powerful arguments for the truth of evolution. And it is not a scientific argument. It's a religious argument.
Yes. Mavis says, hello, Rebecca. Why is it so hard for you guys to understand that an atheist is someone who is not convinced that a God exists? Hunter keeps misrepresenting the atheist point of view.
Yeah. So I was an atheist. I know a lot of atheists, and I read atheists. I've read atheists like Dawkins. The arguments that they use are about the character and attributes of God. They're theological arguments about God. That's why I'm saying this, because if you don't believe that God exists, or if you're not convinced that a God exists, you could not have any knowledge about the attributes and character of God. You would have to say, well, you can't say, well, I'm not convinced that God exists, but if he did exist, he would be like this. Well, how do you know that? That is a metaphysical claim that's not available to you unless you have metaphysical knowledge. So it's coming from somewhere. You have some religious position you're taking. So that's not atheism. Even if you're not, I know you want to soften it. You want to soften it to be someone who is not convinced that God exists. That's a difference without a distinction. You still cannot make the claims that people make when they say, I'm an atheist.
Okay, Titan Uranus says methodological naturalism has nothing to do with miracles at all. It's a way of collating and processing observations.
Right, right. But it comes out of a history of anti-miracle. The reason why it was advocated was to avoid miracles.
And I put up Titan's other questions. I mean, comments really quick. It says that it happens to disprove miracles is inevitable, but not the intent.
He's talking about evolution, right?
Yeah, but he's the methodological naturalism. He says disproves miracles. This is very problematic, isn't it? I want to hear you respond to this.
Yeah, yes, you're right. You got it. Yeah, you're under the burden. Titan here has taken on the burden of demonstrating how methodological naturalism has or does disprove miracles. So you're claiming that it disproves miracles, but you would have to demonstrate that. How? Give me an example of how it did that. Show where it did that. The fact that you're claiming that so easily, it's such a facile claim. Oh yeah, well, it disproves miracles. Oh, really? Like, you just made a claim that is very difficult to defend. I think it's impossible to defend, actually. I think you're thinking that it's obviously true. So that's a big problem in your claim there.
And other two quick comments. Evolution makes no theological claims. Evolution doesn't fail on its predictions. So I'll let you respond to those as a closing.
Yeah, I like the second one because it should be non-controversial or less controversial. Both of them are not controversial because it does make theological claims and it does fail. So both claims are false, and it should be not controversial. So this shouldn't be difficult. But on the predictions one, we just did a video here on one of the false predictions. It was on the histone proteins. So if what would be your response? How do you say, if you're saying it doesn't fail in its predictions? We just looked at a black and white objective prediction that objectively failed. And so how can you then say, oh, well, it doesn't? So I said this earlier in the video, by the way. You may remember I said a couple times, Rebecca, where I said, I think you said, well, what's going on today? What happened? And I said, they just swept it under the rug. And it's just that they just say, oh, whatever, evolution is true, so don't worry about it. So I said that, an hour ago, and here we have it. It doesn't fail its predictions. That's the denouement right there. That's the denouement. There's no failure. I mean, this is not just Titan. I'm not picking on Titan here because I've literally been in discussion with professors and other people in print who make this sort of a claim. There's no failure. What are you talking about? There's no failure of any predictions. And so we have a real cognitive dissonance, just like the 2002 textbook that made the claim that was totally falsified by Behe's paper that was 5 years earlier. So you just have these bare assertions that are anti-empirical, non-factual claims. This is where we're at with evolutionary theory. This is what evolutionists typically say. They just make these insane, obviously false predictions without hesitation, as though it's just obviously true.
Yes, and with that, we can say that if anybody challenges this, Dr. Hunter has a paper listed below, that an article he's written on about 22 or 23 false predictions that evolution made. So anybody can access that. You can read them. And, if you have a complaint about those, you can send them to me and, maybe we can make a show on it or something. But, he has pointed out many false predictions. And so, yeah, evolution has a hard time because evolution is not true. Thank you all for watching and appreciate all the support, all the comments, and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca.